Hello viewers, for DIYers here with another video for everyone. In this particular video here, I'll be showing you how to replace the outer tie rods on a 3rd generation Dodge Ram. This is a 2006 1500 4-wheel drive model. A similar procedure may also apply to other trucks of a different model and years as well. Eventually, tie rods will wear out over time. They use a ball-style socket similar to a ball joint. They are equipped with a rubber boot which keeps in the grease and keeps out any dirt. This boot will fail, allowing lubricant to escape and enable dirt entering the socket. This will cause the socket to wear out, creating play. Or with age, the socket will eventually wear, and this too can create play. Depending on how worn the socket is, you may notice clunking, wandering steering, and tire tread wearing out quicker. In an extreme situation when it fails, the socket will pop apart and make your wheel turn in a random direction, potentially creating an accident or causing excessive damage to your vehicle. With the wheel elevated off the ground, you can grab onto it at the 9 and 3 o'clock positions and push in or pull out on each side. You'll feel play. This can sometimes be done with the wheel on the ground. It can be a little hard to feel though. Another option is having someone sit in the vehicle and wiggle the steering wheel left to right while watching the joint. Grabbing onto the wheel at the 12 and 6 o'clock positions, this is used to check the ball joints and bushings, but I'll save this for another video. To remove the wheel, the lug nuts are 22mm. Then remove the wheel. Now a close-up of the play on the tie rod socket. Grabbing onto the knuckle, push in and pull out like the wheel is turning, and watch for the play. Even when grabbing onto the tie rod, I can move it up and down too. With the tie rods being exposed to road debris, a wire brush is recommended to clean up the threads. There should be a hex portion on the inner tie rod. This may vary depending if yours has been replaced. I will show an alternative method in a moment. This one here takes a 17mm wrench. Unfortunately, with this being extremely tight or seized, the hex can strip easier or the opened end of the wrench will flex open, sometimes even bending the jaws. The jam nut locking the tie rod into place will need to be backed off. This uses a 24mm. It's best to lock the wrench on the inner tie rod against something like the control arm. If you are having problems, you can switch over to a larger adjustable wrench, which I did on the other side. A dead blow hammer can also be used. It'll provide a good solid hit while not damaging the wrench. This particular hammer comes in a set of 3, made by OEM Tools, model number 25517 from Mobile Distributor Supply. A link to this set will be included in the video description. It doesn't have to be fully backed off, but enough where you can mark the threads so you know the position of the tie rod adjustment. Using a 21mm, remove a nut holding on the taper into the steering knuckle. This side uses a stover nut, which is a type of locking nut, so there's no cotter pin to be removed. I moved back the jam nut on the inner tie rod slightly further. You can use a paint marker, but a thin piece of tape works great too. Mark out where the tie rod end stops on the threaded rod. This will keep your position fairly accurate. Finally is disconnecting that taper. There are various methods for removing these. I'll cover a couple in this video. There is a hex on the bottom so a hammer can be used to knock out that taper. If this were a threaded tip and you were keeping the tie rod end, then a joint separator would be recommended instead. Then unthread the tie rod. This was the easy side. The other side was much more difficult, and you'll see that in a moment. As you can see, the pivot moves fairly easy and some play can be felt. New tie rods are typically harder to rotate due to the tighter clearances. Clean the taper in the steering knuckle. Compare the old and new tie rods to ensure they are the same. The new replacement can be greased. This isn't the case with all replacement options. Thread on the new tie rod and try to line it up as close as possible to the position mark. This can be adjusted slightly when everything is back in place. Install the taper portion into the steering knuckle. The new tie rod will come with new hardware. This uses a castle nut instead and also has thread locker pre-applied. The torque spec for this nut is 45 foot-pounds or 61 Newton meters, then tighten an additional 90 degrees. Make sure the cutouts on the nut and the hole in the threaded shaft are aligned. Finish up installing the cotter pin. This particular pin just snaps into place so there's no need to bend over the ends. Rotate the inner tie rod to get that adjustment in place. The new and old tie rod should be the same, however we will check everything once it's done. Tighten up the jam nut against the tie rod end. This time around I used a pipe wrench to hold the inner tie rod in place, as I wasn't able to get a good hold with using the wrench. To tighten, the new tie rods have a hex, so it's a bit easier to tighten up that jam nut. Not all have this feature. The old tie rods are just rounded off on the outside. The torque specifications for that jam nut is 94 foot-pounds or 127 newton meters. If yours is a serviceable tie rod, you'll most likely need to install the grease fitting. Remove the rubber cap, then install the grease fitting using a 8mm wrench. And as a final step, I like to give the joint one pump of grease just to be safe, ensuring it's fully lubricated. I like using something which is intended for high pressure use and can withstand high temperatures. Install the supplied fitting protector. Then the wheel can be installed. The torque specifications for the lug nuts is 130 foot-pounds or 176 newton meters. Moving on to the driver's side, this is where I ran into the typical rust belt issues. This side was already elevated, then was removing the wheel. 22mm is needed for the lug nuts. Again, using the wire brush to clean up those threads. I applied some penetrating oil this time around. The hex wasn't in good shape on this side. This side looks to have been replaced already. I can see marks on the inner tie rod from when somebody previously used a pipe wrench, and this tie rod is also a serviceable version. This time I had to resort to heat. A propane torch did the trick. The tip of the inner blue flame is the hottest part, and this will need to touch the jam nut. Some penetrating oil can also be applied with the heat, and it'll work its way between the threads. Penetrating oil is flammable, so be mindful of that, and have a fire extinguisher close by just to be safe. Once that nut was loose, then was working on the tie rod end, and this is where I had the exact same problem. Heat was used here on the tie rod end. The inner tie rod had a pipe wrench pushing against the lower control arm, and I used a second pipe wrench on the outer tie rod. There is enough movement in the joint to get it rotating a small amount, and then everything is adjusted again. I was able to use my foot while holding onto the bottom part of the bumper. This tie rod was still good, but for peace of mind I'd rather replace both, so I don't have to visit this in the near future. The inner tie rod was rotated back, the pipe wrenches were repositioned, and again was loosening. After it was loosened up, then I removed the nut holding on the steering knuckle side. This one had a castle nut with a cotter pin. The cotter pin is removed using pliers. The castle nut can now be removed. It uses a 21mm. For this side I'll be using a pickle fork. This is a second method for separating a taper. However, if you are keeping the tie rod end, this may not be the best method either, as you can damage the boot, which I did. Remove the old tie rod. This side didn't spin off freely like the opposite side. A pipe wrench and pliers were needed. The threads were cleaned up using a wire brush. This will make the assembly much easier. This side wasn't marked, but instead I made note of the space between the tie rod end and the jam nut. Thread on the new tie rod and try to line it up as close as possible to the position mark. The mounting surface for the new joint was cleaned up on the knuckle. Here's another view of that castle nut and retaining clip. The longer portion gets installed through the one side of the nut, in the hole of the threaded shaft, and then out the other side. The outer clip just locks into place on the nut. Install the new castle nut and torque that to 45 foot-pounds or 61 newton meters, then tighten an additional 90 degrees. Again, make sure the hole is aligned to install that retaining clip. Then install the retaining clip and ensure it's locked into place. Remove the rubber cap and install the new grease fitting. This particular version uses an 8mm. Give it one pump of grease then. And finally install that protective cap. This time was using a 15-inch adjustable wrench for more leverage. Usually I avoid adjustable wrenches as they can sometimes cause the hex to deform. It's always important to use a good quality adjustable wrench which has minimal play in the jaws, and make sure those jaws are tight against the hex on the fastener. Again, the torque specifications for the jam nut is 94 foot-pounds or 127 newton meters. Then install the wheel. The torque specifications for the lug nuts is 130 foot-pounds or 176 newton meters. Lower the truck onto the ground and ensure it's sitting level. You can stick a level underneath the truck on a straight cross member to verify this. It's important it's level from side to side. Going inside the truck, make sure your steering is in the center position. I would recommend taking your vehicle in for alignment, as this can be accurately checked. This is just a driveway method to get you mobile again. I did a video using a Ford Ranger a while ago explaining the different steering adjustments and how it affects your handling. If you're seeking more information on that, be sure to check it out. Here I'm only checking and making slight adjustments to the toe. Improper toe adjustment will cause handling issues along with excessive tire wear. A string is ran past the front and rear wheels. Then it's squared up using the rear wheels as best as possible. Use the furthest point of the wheel to get the most accuracy. Don't use the tire sidewalls as it may have slight variations. You'll need a string on both sides of the truck so you can double check the measurements when making adjustments, as the steering may move a little. The driver's side was fine, however the passenger side was slightly off. There should be a slight amount of toe in. Based on my 17-inch wheels, there is about 1.5 millimeters or about 1/16 of an inch difference between the front and rear measurements on the edge of the wheel on the front wheels. This would be the same for both the passenger and driver's side. Normally toe would be checked using the tire tread, but due to the pattern on this truck, it's hard to measure from the exact same edge, unlike what's on the other car. There is consistent lines in the car's tire tread. The measurements would be done on the front wheels from the front and rear parts of the tire. When done, tighten up the jam nuts on the tie rods to lock the adjustments in place. After that, take your vehicle for a drive ensuring it's good. The steering should be straight. Make sure you're testing it on a road without a crown. New videos are released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. And if you're not a subscriber, be sure to also hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.